Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 209th episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. And to finish off the series all about telling your story, I have a really special guest for you. Welcome to Sathya Bala. Sathya is an energetic leader, business owner, and a community builder fueled by building a more equitable world through her work. She brings her experience as a senior influencer and on-the-ground changemaker, starting at Deloitte in Risk and Audit, moving on to data governance at Sainsbury's, Barclays, HSBC, and Deutsche Bank. Sathya then moved into diversity, equity, and inclusion, sponsoring these initiatives in her last role at Chanel as head of global data governance. Now, Sathya is a consultant, entrepreneur, thought leader, board advisor, and speaker focused on using data and stories to make organizations more equitable. She is founder and community organizer for My Skin, My Story, which empowers women of color all around the world. And in 3 years, she has run 30 events and built a membership of over 500 people. Sathya also sits on the board of a national cancer charity and dance company. In speaking, she demystifies identity, bias, intersectionality, inclusion, and how to champion equity by tapping into stories and humanizing data. Sathya embraces her lived experience as a Sri Lankan Tamil woman born in Singapore who grew up in Sydney and moved to London as a young adult. She inspires others with her story and is proud to amplify underrepresented voices. And Sathya was awarded Top 100 Ethnic Minority Executives by Yahoo Finance, has been recognised by the UK National Diversity Awards and Juno Freelancer Awards. So needless to say, we are going to have a great conversation. So Sathya, a huge welcome to the show.
Hi, Layla. I'm so glad to be here.
Oh, we're very excited to have you. And I've just read out your bio, but I think it's great for listeners to hear what you're working on at the moment.
Yeah, sure. So I think as maybe many people can relate, I'm juggling various things at the moment, but that's kind of how I like to do it. So it will be 2 years at the start of October of me running my own business for the first time in my life, True Change, which is after a corporate career, maybe following the safe immigrant kid path. I have done something pretty new and probably quite rebellious in my parents' perspective, and have kind of taken all the things I've learned from a skills standpoint of my data background and my governance background, taken all the things I do in my community work around storytelling, as well as all the things that I started to take on above and beyond the day job and diversity, equity, inclusion to start my own consulting business. And so that's really become my main focus at the moment, to really get that off the ground. It's been a great year so far working with some big corporate clients, but now I'm starting to own my ambition and taking my own advice that I give a lot of other people around being bold. And I'm really trying to grow the business so that I can be financially successful and do more work on the community stuff I do. So I also run My Skin, My Story, which up until now has been fully volunteer-led by myself. And that's around connecting, empowering, and elevating women of color around the world. We turned 3 years old at the end of June. And right now it's that juggling act of how do I make sure that my business is successful so I can keep doing these other things, but also start to monetize and value the time I put in those other things. So I'm kind of in this space of trying to focus on growing things so that I can keep having a bigger impact, because I've kind of owned the fact that when I succeed, I'm here trying to multiply the success of those around me, especially other women of color, which is a community I really care about. So yeah, that's what's going on, the classic juggling act.
Thank you, Sathya. Yeah, I'm really great. And of course, you invited me to be a speaker at My Skin, My Story, talking about mental ill health, bullying at work, and the recovery and coming through the other end. And you talked about, your own career journey. You were a data specialist and then equality, diversity, and inclusion within data, and expressing that and weaving stories through that. What was your career journey? How did you get to that point?
Yeah, so I explain my career journey as a series of plans and accidents, which I think most of us can relate to. And if I rewind back to being a wide-eyed student in my last year at university in Sydney. I did IT, which in itself is like a huge kind of plan and accident combination of me coming out of school and having no idea what to do. I had like 5 different faculties on my university preferences, which is how it works in Sydney. And I literally was enrolled in a graphic design course, went on holiday during my final year exam results coming out. This was before, like, I don't know, mobile phones and stuff. So disappeared on holiday with my parents, came back to find out I'd gotten into this IT scholarship course. And I was like pretty pragmatic. I was like, well, if they're going to pay me to do this course, I'll do that. I was probably less creative than what I'd hoped, but if you've heard me on a podcast before, I often mention I wanted to be Alicia Keys at 16. That got shut down. So I was like, well, if I'm not going to be that, a singer and a dancer, I might as well do my best on the practical path. So, you know, in a very short nutshell, that continued my graduate role. You know, I applied for lots of IT graduate roles. I was really lucky that I was in a big city and did a degree where there were a lot of graduate roles out there. You'd almost bump into the same people, like we were all interviewing for the same roles. And literally, my friend said no to one offer. She called me and she said, Sath, I reckon they're going to call you, because I was on the waiting list. Hung up with her and they called me. It was Deloitte, and I essentially took her spot. And she ended up working at the place that I would have gone to work if she hadn't said no to the other one. So I started off at Deloitte, Big Four, thrown out at client sites, wide-eyed, clueless, quite afraid. But that was really where I learned to be resilient and trust myself, because I felt very young. I was very young because I finished school pretty quickly, and having to build authority and credibility, not just within a company, but when you're literally being plonked out at a client to audit a process and tell them something that they don't know about something they do every day, is in and of itself quite a challenge. And so I guess I was from the very start used to challenging circumstances, used to quite a male-dominated environment, because Big Four, I was in IT audit, which was then you know, the clients were heads of IT who were like a lot of white middle-aged men. And then I started moving into more generic audit. But again, those are finance directors who at that time were also a similar kind of demographic. So my career journey was about not just what I was doing, but figuring out how to navigate it in the package that I was in. So I often talk about this story of, you know, it took me maybe a year to realize that, okay, it didn't happen all the time. Probably didn't even happen half of the time or a third of the time, but it happened enough where it was a pattern. And I had to walk into every new client assuming that perhaps that senior IT director or finance director that I was having a kickoff meeting with my team would address one of the male members of my team, assuming he was the senior person and not me. So that need to be excellent, to establish credibility in a room immediately, knowing that not just that I was an unknown entity, but people probably assumed I wasn't the person in charge. That's something that kind of continued. But I also think what I've ended up doing now, which is speaking up and speaking truth where there is challenges, that came from my audit background. Because I was, right, like we would get flung into clients, look at a process, find out where it didn't work, where it broke down, and share that with the people that owned those processes. So I continued to do that at Deloitte in Sydney. I got the itch 3 years into Deloitte and came to London, as a lot of Aussies do. Continued in audit and risk at Barclays and then at Sainsbury's. And again, the plan was, yeah, Barclays sounds like a good idea. London's a big financial hub. Why not? But then it was also trust and intuition where I moved to Sainsbury's, because a colleague of mine who I really respected, who was also a friend, she moved to Sainsbury's from Barclays, and she called me and she's like, I think you'll love it here. There's a role, you should go for it. And because I trusted her, I went for it. And I think that's another pattern in my career. I really loved Sainsbury's. She was right. I built really great relationships and friendships. And that's where I fell into data. Again, I didn't see that for myself, but my boss, the audit director and the CFO tapped me on the shoulder and they said, hey, we've created this new role and we think you should do it. And I was like, okay. It's not that because they saw it, I suddenly saw it. It's because I respected them that I was like, cool, I'll try it. And that began really the journey that I'm on now of continuing in this space of data governance, finding the business context of data. I wasn't a techie person, but I started to enter data spaces where I realized actually being a woman of color, it was being talked about because we were talking about tech and how to diversify it. And I started to realize without knowing it, I'd kind of become a different kind of role model, not just because I was a woman and a woman of color doing well, but I was doing well in a space that was, data tech centric. And because I cannot ignore the fact that my life has been affected and the lives of people that I care about by barriers, I started to clock on to this whole diversity, equity, inclusion thing. I ended up contracting in data for a bit in a few banks, and then I started at Chanel as the head of data governance. And I said in my interview, I want to sponsor diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this was at the end of 2019. I joined in March 2020, and suddenly everyone was talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. And I could see really quickly that my data skills was so sorely lacking in the conversation. There was so much noise about like how that data was a problem and it actually held us back and we couldn't do things without data or we can't collect data. And it just felt like there's so many people talking about data that didn't know what they were talking about in this space, and it was holding progress back. And then I also got to a point where in my career, I had organically always felt like I wanted to make things easier for people coming up behind me. Younger women of color would always approach me because I guess I seemed like an approachable person who was doing quite well that kind of looked like them. And I realized again in 2019, I wanted to be more intentional. I didn't just want to organically support and cheerlead other colleagues or call out issues. That's when I was like, actually, not only do I want to lead conversations on diversity, equity, inclusion, and change using my leadership role, I also wanted to create a community outside of work because I think there are so many powerful stories, resources, and wisdom that women of color have, which is a community I really care about, that we don't see. And as a woman of color, I don't see those other women of color succeeding. And so that's why I started my community. But that career journey, this was happy accidents and plans. And how I ended up now, I can kind of see that all those things were meant to happen.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for such an in-depth insight into your career, Jenny. And I love that accidents and plans. That's brilliant. And then thinking about your identity, because of course, your identity, your heritage is Sri Lankan Tamil, and then you were born in Singapore, and then you grew up in Australia. How has that shaped your culture, and what does the term embracing identity mean to you?
Yeah, I think irrespective of who you are, whether you have visible characteristics that make you feel other from the space that you're in, or you just feel that way because of things under the surface, I think all of us can relate to, even at school, at some point realizing the things that we need to hide about ourselves that weren't cool, right? That would maybe cost you some cool points or maybe give you a hard time. And we all very early on, without recognizing it, I think earlier than we realize, we subconsciously hide parts of ourselves. And even when you can't. So like I remember, trying to distance myself from my brownness. And it's like, well, that's not even possible, but there's not one way to be brown. There's not an arbitrary list of things that you have to be or do to be brown, but also that they shouldn't be things that you hide because actually they're beautiful things of my culture that tie me not just to my parents and my family, but to a heritage that even if I don't live in a place where my people are from, I'm connected to it. And so I think when the journey of identity and embracing identity, I think for me has been a lot of unpicking, rewinding, and deprogramming to almost get to who I was all along that I've forgotten, but then taking all the wisdom and things that I've got, because by navigating a world that wasn't built for me, that has also become part of my identity. Do you know what I mean? So I think, for me, it was that mix of, I talk about my skin color being the reason why I fight for equity for all. Because actually, I don't just want to help other Sri Lankan Tamil women or women of color. I think that all of us suffer because none of us feel like we can really be ourselves. We're all hiding parts of ourselves. And it's totally fine if you're that person who's like, when I'm at work, I don't want to share things about myself. But I think what we're talking about is where you don't have a choice. You're hiding things because you feel unsafe, or that it'll be penalized, or you won't succeed because of those things. And so for me, there's kind of three things that have come out of where I am now. I realized that identity is one of my superpowers. So some of them are specifically about my actual cultural identity that I have gathered. So the fact that I love dance, and I know you talk about mental health, dance is a big part of me feeling comfortable in my body and in my mind. I have that love of dance because I started training in Bharatanatyam, which is a big dance form in the Tamil culture. My mum did Bharatanatyam. From the age of 5 to 21, I did that. And that's the reason that even when I moved to London, I kept dancing in Western styles. And so for me, identity, embracing that identity, is being proud of that part of me and the fact that I inherited that. But also part of my identity is the fact that I'm now owning my story and owning the fact that it was okay that I felt that I needed to hide parts of myself, because actually it wasn't me, it was the system. And actually part of my identity is also owning things like my name. Sathya means ultimate truth. And that does not mean I did not lie. I was an only child in an ethnic household and a girl. I know how to lie. It was like a survival mechanism. But I am able to tell truths. I think my superpower is truth telling, and feeling compelled to do that for justice. And that is just as much part of my identity as well. It's not just the name itself, but actually all those challenges and barriers have made me almost live up to that name.
Thank you. Yeah, lots to reflect on. And speaking of dance and mental health, episode 87, everyone, is all about why dancing is good for mental health. So yeah, to back up everything that Satya is saying, and Bharatanatyam, yeah, flipping hardcore. So that is awesome and really, really amazing. There's no way I could do Bharatanatyam. I don't think. So yeah, incredible. And it's not, it's the dance of deep spirituality as well. So it's the movements and how they link to the deep spirituality. Yeah. And you kind of touched on it, but I wanted to ask, when it feels too vulnerable to embrace your identity, like you said, sometimes you want to go into work and you don't really want to share things, and that's absolutely fine. But what do you advise people to do? So maybe this has come up as a topic in My Skin, My Story, but also, there is a pressure sometimes when something happens that global majority, women of color, people of color get asked, oh, what do you think about this? And we all have to have an answer, right? So what do you also advise workplaces around not pushing people to be vulnerable when they don't want to be?
Yeah, 100%. So I 100% feel like the number one thing is to find the places that are safe for you to be vulnerable in. So if it is not safe for you, there is no harm. And actually, I think it's better not to do that, because actually there is no selfishness in protecting your well-being, because we can't be the best for others if we harmed, traumatized, unsafe ourselves. So this is why I kind of created My Skin, My Story. I would say whether it's individual cheerleaders, trusted friends, or community spaces, or a combination of all three, the people listening, could you list a bunch of those safe havens for you, where actually even when you're feeling your most raw and things happen, because unfortunately the world isn't where we want it to be, things still happen where our identity is challenged, or it leads to barriers or discriminations. When it feels too vulnerable to embrace identity in a mixed space, right, or maybe in an unknown space, an unknown quantity, where are your safe places? So practice in those safe places and actually get validated in those safe places where you actually don't have to explain your identity at all. People just get it, right? That's why I built My Skin, My Story. You walk into the virtual space, a physical space. When you share your experiences, no one's like, well, is that really what happened? Or was that in your head? You're automatically worthy, understood, accepted. But I would also say, take those moments where if you feel compelled sharing and embracing your identity is super contagious. So I would say actually to people, and it's probably not a coincidence that I was able to embrace my identity further down in my career, because I had reached credibility and people listened to me. I had a certain level of authority. So I would also say, actually, if you're in a position that has influence and you feel like you've kind of worked to a point in your career or work, whatever it is, where you have enough supporters around you that actually it's a less of a risk for you, those are the people that really should be embracing their identity and actually stepping into how them doing it will inspire and make other people not just feel safe, but also courageous to do it too. I would also say this is not just for people who look different to the dominant groups to do. So I think sometimes people want to ask questions like, where are you from? And it can be triggering because the subtext is, well, you're obviously not from here. I would say, well, actually, if you're curious and perhaps you think you're from the dominant group, actually, how can you just start to share more of your story? Like, start the conversation about where you grew up, what your favorite food was growing up, the things that you've inherited from your family, traditions, whatever, culture, and then make it a fair exchange. Because I think you spoke about also how workplaces maybe might assume that certain people need to explain things when things go on in the world. I use the word burden a lot. How do we make sure that this burden is not sitting on the people who are already suffering from the situations that we see that are unfair, that are unjust in the world? So those small versions of that is actually, if you're a straight white guy, how about you start sharing your story? Because then it makes other people feel safe. Identity is something that's not just owned by people who look physically different or maybe tick those diversity boxes on those forms. So that's kind of the small action. And I would say the bigger action is in workplaces. How do leaders actually do this from an allyship standpoint? It doesn't have to be the Black woman that's paraded around to explain things or share their identity. I'd also say when you're trying to bring underrepresented voices the spotlight that they need, you should also not be afraid as a workplace and actually should feel encouraged and compelled to pay experts who are professional speakers that know how to speak about their experience in a way that it does not create anxiety for them. We should value that. We shouldn't assume that people who have a certain background are experts on situations, and we shouldn't put that burden on them. So I think it's really important to recognize that, but there is something beautiful in creating safe spaces where stories can be shared. The stories are the small elements that create our identity. And I think that being role modeled not just by people who are from underrepresented groups, but actually more so from dominant groups, makes it that fair exchange, makes it feel safe, and also removes the burden on people who actually already have a whole lot of burdens on their shoulders.
And I talk about that as well. People go, oh, but I'm just interested in people. And I say, well, okay, then you share your Easter traditions. And then you can say to someone, oh, is there anything that you do for Easter? And they might say, no, we don't. My cultural background is this. But you can't just go in there cold and press on bruises. It's yes, I'm really glad you said that, because I talk about that a lot when I do training. Yeah, thank you. And then going back to the data point, because I think you're absolutely right. Data is really missing, and it's still very missing in this, DEI conversation. So what, in your work that you do, how do you, and of course it's not this is deep work. This is not just, summarize in a sentence. So, but giving an overarching flavor of what can workplaces do, what do you advise workplaces on how they can use data to celebrate diversity, but also really understand the picture before they start celebrating?
Yeah, so I think like anything in the workplace, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, what type of organization. When would we ever try to tackle a workplace challenge based on gut feel, random anecdotes, and sentiments? If we had a poor performing product, the first questions out of people's mouths are, show me the data of the past performance, where we are now. Let's talk to some customers about why they're not buying it. Let's do some listening. All of these things are data points. All of these things also call for accountability, because someone's asking those questions and someone's also on the hook to provide that data, and no one's shocked that people are asking for that information. And then that information is 100% what feeds into action of how to improve the situation. So why would we try to do something different with diversity, equity, inclusion, which is a business priority, challenge, and strategic outcome, right? Because I'm not going to rattle off all the information. We all have the internet. There are studies beyond studies of how this is something that is not a philanthropic thing. This is not about just doing the right thing. This is something that is just like sustainability, just like the digital age. This is something that we all need to do to survive and thrive as individuals, but also as groups of people, also as businesses, right? Because also businesses interact with people. Your customers come from everywhere. If we were to talk about global majority, there's a reason why people are using that term global majority, because we are the global majority. And even in countries where you're not, that's where the biggest increase in spending power is happening. So with all of that, data is about understanding the reality of where we're at. How can we ever address an issue if we don't know what the issue is, unable to quantify it and dig into the root cause? Also, it is about keeping us motivated, right? Because this is long-term work, as you've kind of already mentioned. And so we need data to not just keep us honest, but also keep us committed. Actually, yeah, these are hard issues. Maybe we have some data that points to why we're unable to hire certain groups of people or retain certain people, maybe why certain customer groups aren't buying into this. But then with that same data, we want to celebrate progress, right? And say, actually, things are changing. Also, data is a beautiful way of also just embracing the fact that the world is diverse, and actually we're just trying to mirror the world around us, right? So I think data is something that's really powerful, but I also make the connection to stories. This is about like individual stories like yours, like mine. We're all just humanizing the data, right? So I think stories are really important in keeping us committed, because this is long-term change. But data can be amazing at driving change, shining a light on unknowns. So people might think there's certain issues with diversity, equity, inclusion, but they might not be it. It could be something else. And there's one great example that I've heard of with a company I deal with. They're a big global company, and there was a narrative internally that in a few departments, people were saying that, oh, we're unable to hire women and people of color because actually they're not applying to the job. But after a while, the data was dug into at every stage of the recruitment funnel, and they found that actually those people were applying, but the first step of internal review and screening was where they were being eliminated. So it's very convenient to be like, well, actually, it's because the talent's not out there. But actually, the data showed that the talent was out there and applying, but there was bias in the processes, meaning that they then couldn't get into the first round of interviews and so on. So that, that is so powerful. It helps us direct finite resources on a complex issue on where it's really needed.
Yeah, thanks so much, Satya. It's so true. And those stories I've heard many, many times. And then when you look at it, one organization that I worked for, it was you had a 10% chance of being shortlisted. It was literally this clear cut 10% chance of being shortlisted if you were white, 5% if you were South Asian, and 2.5% if you were black. So it was super stark. And yet it was, oh no, we don't have a problem here. So yes, so we know that this isn't easy work. There's a lot to hold. We go through ups and downs. When things go well, they go really well. I think when things are challenging, they're really challenging, and our own sort of lived experiences and stories can come to the fore. So how do you look after your own mental health? What are your top 3 tips that you'd like to share with us today?
Yeah, so this is something I'll be honest, I really had to navigate, because I've had to be a bit more intentional with this, having in the last year and a half or so started my own business. Certain social interactions that were just given being in a workplace, even when like 2 years of that was virtual because of COVID, meant that I've actually had to be strategic and intentional in making sure I have social interactions with people that are just about fun or joy, or talking absolute crap about a TV show, or I don't know, mindless celebrity gossip of whatever might be happening. And so for me, it's about carving out time where you are able to switch off from work. And where that's not automatically coming through in your life, like for me, it was because I shifted into being a solo entrepreneur. I've actually had to take that effort and construct that time and be more active reaching out to people than before, because it wasn't just automatically happening. For me, it's also about, I've really enjoyed reading books. I don't know, and for me, it's fiction. I guess you're hearing a theme here. I talk about stories a lot. It makes so much sense now why I love fiction, and why and have ended up doing what I do now. I don't know about other people. I found myself being really sick of screens because of COVID, but then again, now I work from home for my business, and then, okay, I log off my computer and then make dinner, and then now I'm back on another screen to watch Netflix. And for me, there's something about reading that feels, I don't know, productive. It's not a screen, and it's something that gives you an escape, but it also feels like you're learning something, and it's not just like a binge moment where you're being mindless. So I think reading for me has been great. And one thing that's been really good is the first half an hour of the day before looking at your phone, messages, emails, I read with a cup of tea, so that the start of the day, your mind is not kind of in that noise and, oh, I have to do this, I have to do that. I think that's really powerful. And then for me, again, I've struggled with the routine of this. I used to dance 3 times a week before COVID. Dance is such a thing of joy. I don't think you have to be a dancer to dance. Give yourself some dance breaks at home, even if you can't take yourself off to a class. Get that song that you know you can't help but get up to. For me at the moment, ever since Renaissance, it's Cuff It by Beyonce. I literally cannot sit still when that song comes on. So yeah, music, dance, movement, getting out of your head into your body.
Brilliant, beautiful tips. Thank you so much. And finally, of course, if people want to work with you, and I will, of course, include the links in the show notes, how should they contact you, Sathya?
Of course. Well, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I share a lot about my work with True Change and My Skin, My Story on there. So Sathya Bala on LinkedIn. True Change, we have a website, truechange.co. I am, in the hustle. The business has done really well, but I'm always looking for organizations to partner with that really care about using data and storytelling to drive change on diversity, equity, inclusion. And I'm always hoping to spread the word on My Skin, My Story. If you're a woman of color or you want to be an ally, there's events happening all of the time. We're on the socials. Spread the word on that, because I think at the end of the day, having those spaces, back to that point on mental health, those safe spaces where not only are you safe, but you're celebrated, are so important. And that's exactly what My Skin, My Story is.
Brilliant. And thank you so much for your time, your wisdom. You're incredibly amazing at explaining things so that everyone will understand them, but it's got a very high level of information that you give. So I thank you so much for that. And it's been a joy getting to know you over the next couple of months and over the last few months. And I hope that we will stay in touch. And thank you again.
Of course. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. And everyone take care, and do join us next month where we are going to be talking about well-being and the power of writing and how this can help you for September, which is Self-Care Month, and also National Inclusion Week is within that. So until then, everyone take care. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.